Nathan, thank you so much for coming. Joe and I really want to learn from you, and we want others to learn from you about grant writing. I was telling Joe about you. You're an anesthesiologist and you specialize in cardiac surgeries. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. So I'm a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist for adults. And so that is really around keeping people alive during cardiac surgery and other sort of really high acuity surgeries. So big part of that's sort of unique is cardiopulmonary bypass. So that's where, in order for the surgeon to work on your heart and lungs, they have to stop them and then a machine has to take over.
Now, are those the 8, 9, 10-hour surgeries you hear about sometimes?
It can be. Depends on what the case is or how many different procedures they do with that. But pretty much minimum, it's going to be 4 to 6 hours. Just there's a lot that goes into it to get ready for that. And even if the procedure itself is short when you're on cardiopulmonary bypass, the rest of it can take a while to safely transition on and off of that.
That's amazing. Okay, so in your research, is that what you want to study? Are your research career goals related to improving your clinical performance that way?
Yeah, it's all aligned. So there's a lot of responsibility that goes into doing something that dangerous and then getting someone safely through it, because even with best case scenario, you can have as much as like a 1 in 100 to 1 in 50 mortality after one of these procedures, depending on how sick the patients are and everything else. So for me personally, it's really important to try and do everything I can to keep people safe during that period. And so a lot of questions come up. So if there is an issue, it's like, why didn't this work? What could have been better? What don't we know that could have made this safer? And it is generally, I don't want to mislead people that cardiac surgery is not safe, but there's still a minority of people who have problems because it is, pretty involved.
So question, it's funny when you say that, because I told Joe, as an early career lab tech, thinking about a career in clinical research, often when you're just doing your day job and you think, now, why is that going wrong? Or why do we think this way? Or why haven't we considered whatever? When you're asking why, you're not just taking everything as a given. I think it's a natural signal that you think like a researcher. You're curious, and that's how innovations come, right? And I love hearing that you're doing this very complex work and also sort of meta analyzing what is happening in this room. And if only we had the evidence base. You have an instinct to try something, but would anybody really try it if we didn't have a reason to feel that it's the thing to try?
Right, exactly. Yeah, all the best ideas come from, at least I get from taking care of patients. And often it's, why don't these tools work in this situation, right? So it's very reproducible. 1 million people have this done a year. Occasionally there's people where it doesn't work for. And so that's where the questions come from. Why? What's the problem? What could be better? And working with what you have and seeing what's possible, I think is really important.
So when you find a question and you decide, this is something I want to do research on, this is something I want to write about, how do you begin that? How do you start writing about it? What are some blocks you run into? And just what do you think about when you're starting to write a grant about something?
Yeah, so the first thing is, if I have a question, I'm like, surely someone has thought of this before. Like, there's a whole lot of people doing research, a lot of cardiac anesthesiologists, a lot of people trying to keep other people safe, clinical care, and other sort of questions. So I go and look and see, what have other people done? You go to the literature and you say, here's a study I thought that might be able to answer this question, or this question that I have, what's been done? And oftentimes there, 10, 20, 30 years of work has been put onto that. But that's not a problem, actually. That just means all this has been done ahead of time. That's where you start, right? So it's like this long story of getting to answering that question. And the less is done, there's more work to do, right? But even if there is a big range of what has been studied on a particular topic, you are always thinking, what's the next step? Well, then why aren't we doing this? If people know what's going on, why isn't it being used practically? So that's another piece where there can be a gap.
Okay, can I build on something you said? I'm actually fascinated by this. You said, I'm going to go find literature and maybe I find 20 studies that are on this topic, and you said, well, that's a good thing.
Yes.
Because there's less work to do versus I think a lot of early career novice researchers are just, they would see 20 studies and they say, oh, it's been done. Mm-hmm. Or there's one study that's awfully like the study I had in my mind. It's been done. Now I can't do that. I can't do that. But you said, but wait, now that means I'm ready to advance this area. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, occasionally, very occasionally, I think there is truly an unanswered question. But I think that's a harder position to write from.
It is. Yeah, because you, especially when you're starting out or even when you're established, you can't just come up with an idea out of nothing. No one will invest in that. That's not a safe investment. But at the same time, you need to challenge what's happening. So you need this mix of building on what everyone already knows and accepts, and then saying, have you looked at it this way? Mm-hmm. Right? So you need to get that mix just right, so that they believe you, that you've done your homework, you've looked, you haven't wasted the time of proposing something that's been done 30 other different ways. You're going to build on that and say, here's what's great about this. This is where the field is. This is where it could go. Here's a new question. Here's what's missing. That's probably the hardest thing to understand or find is and see within a knowledge base is what isn't known, what's missing. Mm-hmm. What can't we measure? What do we need to see? And it has to be actionable. That's the other part too.
Say more about that. What do you mean by actionable?
So at least in the clinical realm, and depending, I guess you could apply it to other fields as well, but if I can't come up with a reason with what I would do as a clinician with that information, it's sort of dead in the water. You have to see the entire maybe life cycle of an idea, going from missing information all the way through to how would this change what we're doing.
Is that your preference, or is that a preference of the field of science? Is that just how you pick your things because you care about changing patient care? Aren't there some questions that simply advance science and it's for somebody else to figure out the downstream? Can we talk about that?
Yes, I don't want to be offensive, but I feel like that's lazy. Honestly, you to think of the magical
other person who's
fairy other person who does your work before, like you want to have at least that in mind. Okay. Right. So to say that to have this general, fuzzy idea that someone in the future may be able to do something with this is sort of, you haven't completed your thought.
I think that's the strength of a clinical researcher, frankly, because you're coming from the end user, so to speak. And so you can drive into various gaps. Whereas this is the whole basis for the clinical translational spectrum, to break down silos. So you don't have a bunch of people, really smart people, doing important work that they would be happy to shift it slightly if they thought it would help a patient, but they didn't know. And I would say over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of investment in moving those groups together. Mm-hmm. So you are a basic scientist and a clinical scientist, but you could bring teams together. Mm-hmm. So you could make those linkages. And it sounds like you think modern science needs to do that, even if you're not the one to do the mouse study or to do the policy study.
Yes, you should have at least an idea or propose something, right? So it helps provide a framework you can work out of, and it's a lot easier to sell. Now, general knowledge is incredibly important. We don't always know what is going to work out. Perfect example, I feel like, is statins. Mm-hmm. There was the researcher who just loved fungus. He was just into it and had no intention of applying that to anything beyond its own value of just knowing that. And it ended up being one of the biggest blockbuster drugs in history, is developing statins out of that. So I do think there is absolutely a place for it. And I think it's unanticipated.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's going to happen because you just have so much work that's going on. But I think starting out, or if you're going to write a grant for that research, it's a lot easier if you know what you would do with the information. It's this, you have to chain together all these different pieces, from question to seeing what's done to what information do you need. You're getting resources to then answer that question, and then what?
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't at least have it, it's going to change. Everything changes. It all gets rearranged in the process of actually trying to do something and bring it into reality. But you at least have to have an idea to start so that you know where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So once you do stumble into this problem that you don't exactly know the answer to, you do your homework, you find a framework for it, you have a good idea of what's going on and what direction you want to head. What's your next step to go towards a grant?
So then, I primarily work in the NIH space. So I then...
And what can you say why you do that?
I'm at an academic medical center, and this is the paradigm. And I think all the foundations also use that paradigm. And as such a massive funding agency, I think a lot of governmental funding is just built this way.
Okay.
So if you start there, you can sort of reuse that framework again. So it's probably the standard in my mind. Okay. So that would be why I would go there. And there's that incredible resource of NIH Reporter. Mm-hmm. And so
Could you explain that a little bit for people who are learning about it and don't know all the ins and outs of how to work the NIH resources?
Yes. Yeah. So it's a website, and they report publicly the list of all the funded grants, and actually, I think not active as well. You can
go
filter
way into history.
Yeah. So they have, obviously they're good stewards of the resources, and so that's a way of like public disclosure of here's what we're funding. Even to the point of like how much they're funding, and then the abstracts. So this is a phenomenal resource for anyone who wants to apply for a grant, whether NIH or otherwise. But particularly, it's, I guess, since you are going to be writing, a physical work with that, you need to know what the language is, what they expect. Mm-hmm. And some of that is knowing your audience. Anytime you give a presentation or write a paper or write a grant, you need to know who you're talking to. And so the best way to see what they care about is you go and see what they funded. And then what I like to do is I sort by the size of the budget. So and then you basically, what you have now publicly available is a list of their priorities. And they have limited resources. Here's what they care about. Mm. And then I read down the line. I look for things that rhyme with my particular interest, or what are people talking about? What do they care about? And what have they funded in that space? Mm-hmm. And so then I know if I'm sort of in line with that, or if somewhat it seems like what's trendy or what people are talking about. And so you at least want to be aware of that. If you're proposing something totally different or in line with that, you want to start by having a sense of what they know. Mm. So that would be the next step, is I go and see what's funded. Is this fundable? Is anyone going to care? Because you have reviewers on the other side, right? And these are what the reviewers have heard of. And if you could use some of those concepts, again, it'll feel familiar to them because it is.
So you're selling what they're buying, so to speak.
Exactly. Okay. Or seeing what they're missing and reminding them why they should be buying what you have.
So once you are at that place where you decide that it's a good fit for you, this organization is aligned with where you want to go, what you think you're capable of, and you're putting a team together, what are you looking for in these people when you are saying, I'm going to put something together? I'm looking for, like, what exactly are you trying to find when you think of a successful grant team?
You need to figure out where you're going. Remember that whole life cycle I was talking about of a project. You need to figure out what you practically need and what expertise you have in the context of where you are. So it's a sense of, what resources do you need? What skills do you have? And which ones that you don't have, can you collaborate with someone who has that? So you want to have a really clear sense of what you need to get where you're going. And then you assemble that team, and then you make the case for why this is a really important question. Not only is it important, it needs to happen now because there's some urgency. You have to inject some urgency into why this question matters now. Right. And then they also have to believe you can do it. So assembling your team is about convincing whoever you're asking the money from for the grant, and telling them that if they fund it, this will get done. So they have to believe that. So that's where your team comes out of. Someone needs to have accomplished something previously. You build on past accomplishments to make the case that this if only, right? There's this one last little piece. We found something incredible. It needs to happen now. In my case, I'm like, people are being harmed right now. We need to figure this out. We could save lives. So that makes it easier to sell because there's an immediacy to it. And you can say there's a really helpful word there is like equipoise, right? So it's not working yet. We have two equivalent ideas and we need more information to see which could be better for who. Usually there's like a personalization part, at least on the clinical side. So similarly, that lends a sense of urgency. There's a reason to do it. There's a reason that this team should do it because we're in the right place at the right time with the right people, and it should happen as soon as possible. And look, we did all this work and we're ready to go. So someone else might be able to do it, but we could do it now, right? So like that.
I think you're bringing them up like they're highly related, and they are the way you describe them, but they're actually two super critical separate issues. One is, can you create an urgency to this? This isn't like, well, it's never been done. Not good enough. There's like an infinite number of unanswered questions. Some will never be done. We have limited resources. Like, why should we do this? Why should we do this now? And the extent to which you could say people are dying. I don't want people to die, but like, that sounds urgent, or something about the field is being held back, or maybe the field is going down the wrong path and they don't realize it, whatever. Create some urgency. Good. But then the other thing you said is, this is the right team in the right place at the right time. And I think a lot of people who write grants miss the opportunity to say, pretend I proposed a gap and you believe me. And I proposed this study that will answer the question and you believe me. Well, the third piece is, I want you to fund me and my team. And so we have to say something about that. And that is a real winning combination, I think. You do have to put yourself into the story somehow, whether it's my patient population is ideal for this study, or I'm that guy, I'm that physician who's in the middle of this, and I can lead this team and make sure it stays relevant or whatever. So I really like that. I think those are both important. Sometimes it's hard to do. Sometimes you're stretching to make something urgent, but try.
I think that's a good question, though. Why isn't it urgent? What would make it urgent?
Right, is there an angle to it?
Yeah, exactly.
Good. I like that.
So as you're working in the clinic, like full time, right? How are you finding this extra time to come up with this giant research plan and this team? How do you do that?
Oh, well, I do have protected time with the funded grants, so that helps. But one thing that I've advised people as they're developing a project is if you have the opportunity to bring it as close to your day-to-day work as possible. So I have this concept of like double work, right? So while I'm providing clinical care, I'm always, like I mentioned before, always thinking about how could this be better? What are we missing? What's interesting here? I really feel like my patients are the best teachers. That's where I learn the most from. And so I think if there's a way that you can be almost doing something else that's related and always just being open to ideas, I don't think you can really predict where they come from. But if you stay curious and observant and always have that in the back of your mind. So I do mentor some residents on our research track, and that's what I tell them to do. So they have to put in their 10 or 15,000 hours in 3 years to become anesthesiologists. And so they get a little bit of time towards the end of that training to put towards their research. And so I say, go throughout your day. What do you notice? What questions come out of that? And what interests you? So not only paying attention to the clinical situation or where your ideas come from, but also your response to them, because that can be a good clue to what you want to work this much on, honestly. Because it has to sustain you, because anything after a while and that much work can get exhausting, and there's so many different hurdles to pass from getting a project from idea to funding to completion. You have to care enough about it. And so part of that is knowing yourself, like, what did you respond to? What are you going to stay interested in? And so that it's both. It's, paying attention to the external situation and also your internal situation with that.
That's great wisdom. Um, you know, we've thought this through before where, oh, there's a call for proposals for a certain thing. You're like, well, I kind of like that thing. Maybe it's how close is that thing to what the thing I care about? Maybe I'll do that. Or, that's sort of like extrinsic motivation, right? Where there are these other prompts, or you have a colleague or a mentor who's doing something close but not quite, and you're learning and you are fostering that relationship, all good. And yet in the dark hours, it's you and you trying to get this thing done. At some level, it has to be something that is important enough to you that it's okay. It won't make it easy, but it'll make it worth the work, the hard work. I don't know.
Yes, and building off of that, it sounds like you really do have to make time for it. You do have to care about it. And the more I learned about grant writing, it sounds like it's hard and people fail all the time.
Absolutely.
And I grew up with a mom who was always writing grants and spending long days writing grants and getting a lot of them rejected. And she'd come home frustrated. And so where do you find the motivation when it comes to a hard day in the clinic, and then you got to do this and then that, and then after months and months of work, you're like, here's everything, and they're like, no.
I mean, that's inevitable.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. I think expectations, knowing that that's part of the gig, right?
Okay.
Like that helps. But also, one way, at least for revisions, right? So if they don't hopefully it's not fully killed, like it goes through and they're just like, why would you even bring this up? I'm so offended. Like that almost never happens, it's usually.
Well, you don't want the grant writer's response to be that. Usually the rejection, they don't say that. They just say, yeah, no. And then sometimes the writer is like, they were fully rejecting. And it's like, well, are they? We don't know. We don't know enough information. Don't assume anything.
Right, exactly. And then the other piece is give yourself space to mourn. You at least need an overnight to be like, okay, yeah, this is not what I was hoping for. But then after that, when you look at the comments, which you can choose your reactions to things, and one way to look at those comments it's an invitation to collaborate. Like, we like this, but it'd be better if you included our ideas. So in some ways that's flattering, I suppose, or you didn't meet to some sort of expectation that they had. So they're showing their hand a little bit, right? Here's what we want to see.
Yeah,
so,
we wanted more pilot data, or we wanted to see prior collaborations or something. And you go,
So is that a typical reaction? Them giving you advice on what you could...
Well, it's not framed that way. You have to think of it that way.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So,
Okay.
Yeah, because you can get mad and say they didn't get it or whatever. So I think this is a really important point. The onus is on the communicator. You have to make it easy on your reviewer. So if you're like, I had that on page 11, 3/4 down the page, they didn't even read it. They didn't read my grant. Well, maybe your grant was really hard to read.
Right. Maybe
So
they
they
were
didn't get to
tired
page
by
11.
that page.
Right. So when I picture my reviewers, I think I picture them with 30 to 50 grants on the plane. That's when I think they're going to be reviewing. They want to catch up on their homework, and so I want them to like me. So I want to make their job really easy. So if you can do that, if you can make it easy for them, they'll like you more and then be more open to your ideas.
Yes, I will say when I reviewed, it would be so disappointing when all my grants, well, first I'd read all of them first, and I'd usually say, these are all terrible. I'm like, oh, okay, wait a minute. I'd read the first one, and, oh my gosh, this is awful. Set it aside. The next one, that's awful. And then by the time I get through my whole stack, I'd say, well, maybe that first one wasn't so awful. It was, I had to like set myself. And then I'd put it aside and I'd go back and read. And basically, I wanted to go into the session and advocate for somebody. Like, it's such a disappointment when all the grants you've reviewed don't make the cut and you're like, oh gosh, I really want to go in there and help somebody get funded. And you hope and you hope and you want them, like, come on, right? So I think the extent to which you as a grant writer can appreciate that somebody's working really hard on your behalf, just like help them help you kind of thing. If you feel in alliance with your reviewer instead of like, it's me against you, I have to get past you somehow. No, you want them to like come alongside you and help you. Mm-hmm. And that shapes the way you write a little bit, right? Like Definitely. You care about fewer words, shorter sentences, easier on the eyes, like all the things that would help somebody sitting on the plane, reading as fast as they can, right?
Yes, clarity is everything there. So one thing I try to do is, I think of it as like sort of those nesting dolls a little bit, the grant. So I would use bolding and headings as a way to be, make it efficient. So I wanted my entire grant to just be in the bold sentences. If they skimmed through, I wanted the vast majority of what I wanted them to know to be available in like 30 seconds or less. And so if they can read that and understand what's going on, and then they don't believe me, or they're like, wait, that's interesting, I want to know more. You like open the top doll and then there's another one in there. And they're like, oh, good. There's more. And you're like, okay, so yeah, it's not just the bolded statements, although that was enough to carry the story. And then beyond that, there's more details. And then that keeps going. And because this is how you balance the educated non-experts.
That is a great analogy or metaphor, imagery. That's really lovely, because that also, like in so many things, like in this class, we want to have everybody get some high level knowledge. But there's some people who really want to know more. They want to know more. We want to give them an opportunity to learn more and more, right? But some people are like, I got it. I'm waiting for the next, this is the thing I care about. I'm not as interested in this. But you carried me past it, so that's good. Yeah, that's nice. Now that's, we're talking about this like, yeah, just go do that thing, right? Yes. And yet, this is very hard to do. What strategies have you used to get good at telling the story? I think one thing about you, Nathan, that I know, I told Joe, is you're highly, highly creative. I love that about you. And I remember some of your earliest challenges really being pushed to anchor your big ideas, creative ideas that you're absolutely out of the box, but the field is the box. Mm-hmm. And so you have to somehow link these things together so it doesn't feel like you're just disregarding all of the establishment, right? Mm-hmm. That's one thing. And then I think the more you've developed, you've really appreciated the persuasion and instead of resenting it, like, why do I have to explain this to you? I'm the expert. I'm telling you what needs to be done. But like, let me bring you along this journey and tell you why we should all be going this way. Mm-hmm. Do you think you've evolved that way?
Oh, definitely. And I think understanding what's possible is really important. Yes. So you need to, that's part of seeing the entire project. You need to know what pieces go into it, to know what's out there and just not feasible versus what's really innovative and feasible. Those are two very different things. I've had all kinds of ideas. Some will they survive both the review process and reality checks when you actually try and go and do whatever that is. I think I put a lot more value on that and testing my ideas. Sorry. So you try and break them before you present them.
Yes, I would say feasibility is huge, especially as we're hoping to reach early career researchers or novice researchers. Some of it is persuading the reviewers that this can be done, right? It's feasible. And some is, can you actually do it, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's like, please, please, please believe me. And then, oh my gosh, I have to get this done in the time allotted with the budget I've been given. And that is a different layer of what is feasible. And sometimes it's frustrating because you're like, well, wait a minute, $25,000 sounds like a lot of money. And you go, oh, $25,000, you can't do anything for that much. Okay. Well, when you start sort of budgeting it out, you go, oh my gosh, I get, one clinical coordinator for, a half day a week, how many patients could I recruit in that time?
Right.
Okay, well, geez. So anyway, how do you figure out where those feasibility boundaries are?
It depends on the project, definitely. But for me and where I'm trying to move is towards pragmatic trials. So using existing infrastructure and then overlaying a research paradigm onto that. So if you can have two different types of standard of care, and then you can collect the information from the electronic health record, that can be a way to do it. So any way that you can make it as practical as possible. And then if you are going to need a lot within the budget for something, make sure that you know what you're going to do with that information. This is the anti-fishing expedition plea, right? So with that said, though, you need to have something interesting and exciting, whether that's methodological or something else within, and that's one way to do it. But just have a clear plan of what you're going to do with that if you're going to go after a big ticket, assay or something else. Just know what you're doing with it. But I think using those resources well and having a good sense of what you're going to get out of it, then you can tell whether it's worth it or not within that. So I think that's some of the feasibility and just scale, which you can fit into that. And that's sort of, in a lot of sense, that's your sheet of paper. Your budget is your sheet of paper. You're allowed to draw and crayon whatever you want on there, but just make sure you don't, you have it in proportion to what you can do with it as you split that up, whether it's time or the assays or a type of equipment you need or something else. It's all going to fit on the paper. So that can help you sort of narrow that down. Or you split it into multiple projects. That's the other piece.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind me asking, what has been your hardest challenge in research when it comes to the world of grant writing thus far for you?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see, the hardest challenge. I would say probably you have to stay engaged with it. So I guess the constant rejection can be really challenging. And so probably just not giving up on an idea or the concept that you are capable of doing that. So, because I remember too, starting out, I probably tried 50 different approaches. And honestly, the antidote to that is just staying positive with it and just accepting that, one, acknowledging it's a really hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. So I think by reminding yourself that the rejection is the norm, and that's where you start from, and it does get better, right? So I guess maybe like a little phrase that helped me was like, we don't fail until you stop. Like, it's not a failure, it's just like a next step with that. Not that failure is bad either, in the sense that some ideas should die the death they're given, like that should happen and you should move on to something else. But you can use aspects of that, right? So but if you stay with your question, stay with your goals, stay committed to that, I think realizing that you have to do that and not getting too caught up in that sort of moment is probably one of the bigger challenges, to keep going.
Mm-hmm. Take the longer view. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also think, just to build on what you were saying, Nathan, anybody who's had to resubmit something once or twice, you might have a first submission, a revision, and then the final revision. And, if you're only submitting every 6 months or 9 months or whatever, you've got a long period of time till this sucker gets funded, right? Mm-hmm. And it is a pretty shocking moment. I've done this multiple times where you're like so happy. You're like, oh yeah, we're going to all celebrate. We got this grant funded finally. And then, just to be humble, look at that first submission. And you look at it and you go, what was I thinking? How? Of course they didn't fund this. Who would have funded this? Look at all these problems. And it's really mortifying, at least, but for mine. And you look and you say, wow, this process was so painful, and yet it actually made it better, legitimately better. And what you come up with will be meaningful and impactful, all the things you care about, and all you can do is go, they were right, and you have enough of those happen, you start just like, you're much more, you still have to mourn, and you still have to, you can get mad, sad, angry, whatever. And yet ultimately you're like, okay, you put it aside, and now you just go, this is going to be better. It'll be better. You truly believe that, and nobody wants to resubmit, but you do have some comfort in that process.
Right, and they are collaborators.
I love that. Thinking of your reviewers as collaborators.
They they keep the standards high, and they want to make sure. I mean, they're being good stewards of the resources they've been asked to decide who gets to use those, right? And so they are helping you. They are your collaborators in the sense of figuring out who and when and what. So that's their responsibility. You should make it easy on them to pick you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's a very positive way of looking at it, because not a lot of people would look at it like that. And so it sounds like grant writing attracts a very specific type of person who is able to have somewhat of a thick skin when it comes to constructive criticism. What is your favorite part about this, about grant writing?
About grant writing? Well, it's like a puzzle, right? There's all, you know what pieces need to go into it, and the shape always comes together differently, right? And so there's always a different picture on the front of a puzzle or whatever. So, or maybe not to mix analogies here, but like a set, like a haiku or something has rules, right? But then there's how many different types of poems or different ways can you put it together. So I like that challenge of knowing, well, and there's definitely an end, right? It fits into 6 or 12 pages. So it's a little bit in like, how do you be as clear as possible, fit as much information as possible, and still have the reader get to the end of that and feel like they had an okay time with it, right? That they like you, they like your project, they're excited. And I think too, being in that role of, how do I take something that I've been sort of wrestling with for however long this question, sometimes it's years, sometimes it's a decade, and how do I get it to like, you get it in 5 minutes, right? I think that's, there's an artistic component to that. And so I think even just as its own like literary form, I think it's worth doing, but also there's this other piece that's how science and knowledge moves forward. But just the grant writing part of it, I think that challenge, once you do enough of them, and you get some feedback and you see you really struggle with something and then it gets funded, I mean, that's amazing. It's like, it's like having your own like art exhibition. It goes up on the, into the world, and then you do the work too. And that's another piece of it. But, it's a representation of yourself and your ideas, and it's validation too, right? So like someone else understood it, got it, and felt like it was important too.
Right. It's a high, and you don't get so many of those, right? Like it, although I can remember plenty of grants that I loved dearly that never got funded. But you also really remember the ones that did get funded, and there is so much that goes into it. I agree with that.
When you do look at the ones that have gotten funded versus the ones that have gotten rejected, do you notice similarities between the good ones or the ones who you got, or have you been shocked by any that you're like, this one's definitely getting funded, and then you're like,
you never know. I mean, it's so variable. No. I mean, when you do a good job. Yeah. And the effort that went into it, and when you can tell when if you have opportunity to, you should share a grant with a bunch of people, but if you have a workshop, like I went through quite a few of those as well, you can tell when people are into it. The comments change. They're like, ooh, have you thought about this whole other thing? And you're like, oh, versus like, have you thought about putting these words in this order? When you start getting those kinds of comments, you're close. When it's more like nitpicky, or they're just like excited and they want to know, they ask more questions, that's usually when it's ready to get funded, is when everyone gets it and they're like, well, why hasn't anyone done this? They're all just like shocked that this hasn't happened. You're like, I totally made that up like this, but it's based on real things. But it's that sense of inevitability. If you can create a feeling of inevitability in your readers, those are the ones that get funded.
Oh, gosh, that's beautiful. I feel like we need a T-shirt.
When it's inevitable, it's funded. Yeah, that's a T-shirt.
Exactly. Oh, there's something there. Well, Nathan, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.